In this video, we're going to take a look at this NP208 Chevy transfer case. I got a parts kit with a bunch of bearings and seals and gaskets, and I'm swapping the input shaft out to a 32 spline to fit on a 4L80E. So here we go. Kind of wire brush the case, just kind of inspecting, looking for cracks, looking for anything obvious. Well, that's not a good sign. Next thing I want to check is to see if all the gears work. So I put this all the way up. That's too high. I can feel the output shaft spinning at the same rate as my input shaft here, and I got no four-wheel drive. So that's too high. That's 4 high. This should be neutral. Yep. Got nothing on either output shaft, so that's neutral. This should be 4 low, which it is. See how slowly this is turning compared to me turning the input shaft? And I feel the same thing on the back shaft, the output shaft. It's turning real slow. So at least I know all the gears are working on this thing. Here's all the parts that came in the parts kit that I got for this 208. Then there's a bag full of all kinds of different seals. And then the two parts that didn't come with it, 32 spline input shaft, which I need to mount this up to a 4L80E. It's got a 27 spline input shaft in it. I think right now that would have been for like a 700 R4. So I need the bigger one. And then this seal is that output seal. It didn't come in the kit. It's a GM part number. I'm going to take this little speedometer gear out first. Okay. There we go. There's our tail shaft. Looks like we got a good bearing in there still. So that's good news. This is the oil pump. The oil pump drive. Looks like there's a hole in the front, not in the back. These end ones have washers. This one here and this one here, those have washers. The rest don't. Now what I'm looking for is there should be a little slot to pry on. It looks like there's one here. Kind of full of dirt and grease, so I'm going to get a pick and clean that out so that I can get a screwdriver in there, and then I should be able to pry up on that. You don't want to stick a screwdriver in here anywhere along this seam because you'll damage that seam and then it'll leak. That's why they give you these little prying tabs. There should be one on the other side too. Oh, there we go. It's coming loose. This is where the magnet goes. Yeah, this magnet got a little bit of stuff on it, but not much. Okay, next we've got a spring with a little cup on top. That just sits right on top of that rod. And then over here, we've got a roller bearing, thrust bearing, one shim. It's a pretty thin shim that goes on there. Just like that. And there's a thicker shim that goes on top of this, but I think in my case, it's stuck in the case. Kind of see that shiny surface there. Next, we've got a snap ring right here that holds this front gear on. There we go. Might be able to lift this gear up and get the chain off. Good deal. Now for reference, when we put this back together, this rod, you can see that rod goes through through all these parts all the way down to the bottom. And it's got this little thing that fits in there. And then the whole rod is loose, and it can just kind of turn it and pull it all the way up and out of there. Just like that. The flat part goes down, and the tapered part goes up. Okay, that looks great. It's in perfect shape, no wear. I'll replace these tabs, but this almost looks like somebody else has been in here and rebuilt this already. Okay, we got that out without spilling any needle bearings. There we go. And this shift fork, again, looks awesome. A lot of times these plastic pieces are missing and just completely worn down to nothing. So that's great. Now this low range drum, it's got planetary gears in there. As long as that spins freely and seems to work fine, it doesn't show any metal shavings anywhere, there's no reason to worry about that. I think that's just fine. It's a pretty heavy duty piece. I'm slightly confused by one thing here, and that's I'm only seeing one little washer in here, and that's not even metal. That's like a polyurethane washer, and there's no thrust bearing in here. One of these little guys is supposed to be in there. It should just slide right out. I'm going to roll them around with my fingers a little bit, but they look perfect. You see why you don't want to use too much RTV? This only requires a really thin coat, and if you use too much, it squeezes inside the case and just ends up everywhere. I'm going to try this with the seal puller. Wish me luck. Okay, it's probably not necessary most of the time, but I did put a little bit of gray silicone on the inside of there since I sanded that with some 1000 grit wet sanding paper to take out those little nicks that the tool scratched in there. One thing that's kind of interesting to pay attention to here is these case bolts, or bolts to the transmission adapter. Look at that. Those are all wide open to the inside of the case. So I'm going to have to make sure and put some thread sealer on those, or we'll get transmission fluid leaking through them. So now we have a big roller bearing in there, which again looks fine, looks like new. I don't think I'm going to change that. Well, that didn't work at all. In fact, it bent my seal puller. But looking at this a little closer, there's actually a slot right here where I can get a screwdriver right at the back of that seal. And there's also one under here. How nice of them to put that there. All right, here's the seal that came out of there. It's got a flat edge on it. And here's the one from the kit that looks just like it. It's the same height, same inner diameter, same everything, but look at that. Doesn't fit. That's the wrong seal. How could they do that? Man. So they have these other two gambles here. These look similar, but have a little bit different shape. I think they would fit. They seem like a tight fit, and the inner diameter is the same. So I'm going to have to kind of look at the profile of this old one, see which one it looks the most like. All right, it's time to put the front output shaft back in. And this thing's got a thick washer, a thrust bearing, and a shim. Okay, so I'm going to try and get this to go through that seal here first. Okay, good. That went through no problem. Okay, the shaft is in, and this output flange is on, and this little rubber gasket actually goes down and sits in those grooves. That's what the old one looks like. But I'm actually going to put a little bit of sealer, silicone sealer on that before I stick it down in there, just to be double sure. Get a real good seal on that. So that fits right in between the splines on that shaft. Torque spec is 120 foot-pounds on this. Okay, it's time for the new 32 spline input shaft to go in there. So I'm going to put in the new thrust washer and the new thrust bearing. And then this thing's got a thrust surface right on it here. So there's no washer that goes on top of that. Just going to slide that down in there, and hopefully it goes through that seal nicely. Okay, it's through. Good deal. Okay, in place of this plastic bushing, I'm putting in the roller bearing and then the thrust washer on top of that. Next part is to put the low range planetary back in. It has gears in it, and I noticed there's a little bit of movement in there. I don't know if that's normal or not. There's nothing I can do about it. I think there's a bushing in here that doesn't come in the rebuild kit, so even if I wanted to do something about that, I couldn't. But I'm guessing that little bit of play is probably normal. And then the shift fork, I put the new plastic wear bars on it. Took the old ones off, even though they're in pretty good shape. These are better, they're a little tighter. So this is ready to go back in. Here's a problem that I didn't notice. This shift plate is kind of held by these two little detent pins. There's one there, the spring loaded, and there's one back here for the sensor. And if you see, this shift plate has moved over this way and come off that pin, and now the pin is blocking it from going in. See how much gap there is? This thing is supposed to be pushed in. So what I'm going to have to do, and that makes it so I can't get this planetary gear in there and get the shaft lined up with this slot here. So I'm going to need to try and push these in, these little spring-loaded pins by hand, and then move this plate over. Okay, I had to put down the camera to do that, but now you can see the plate is pushed all the way up against the wall there, and that's riding on top of that little detent pin. Planetary is in, it's all the way down, and it's lined up with its slot on the shift plate. So now I can put the main shaft back in. And I didn't even disassemble this. Didn't see any need to. All the bearings in this thing look good everywhere. So I didn't really see a point in disassembling that and having those needle bearings fall out everywhere. No point, everything spins smoothly. Second shift fork is ready to go back in. I replaced those plastic wear bars on that. There we go. The new thrust bearing, and if you look closely, it almost looks like there's more bearings in the new one. They're spaced tighter together than in the old one. The old one still looks fine, but I'm just going to use these new ones. Okay, the oil pump gear is headed back on. I remember saying there's a dot on the top and the dot goes up. And actually there's kind of a chamfer on the inside edge, not on the outside. So that will only go on one way. And this one I drew an arrow on. That is a ring pliers for doing piston rings. I bet you that'll work. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Nice. Okay, I think what I want to do next is just assemble this thing loosely with the covers on dry. And just put a few bolts in and test everything out, make sure the shift mechanisms work, make sure everything seems to be working the way it's supposed to. I already cleaned all these surfaces off to get all the old silicone out of there. So I just want to put all this together and test it out before I seal it up for good. Looks like 2 small tabs and a big tab in that, and then 2 small tabs and a big tab in this. So as long as we match that up, should be in good shape there. In fact, and for some reason, it's not fully seated. I'm not sure why we have that gap in there. I've been fighting and fighting with this thing. I've had this whole main shaft in and out of there several times. I thought this shaft must not be going down all the way. This shaft has a nose on the end of it that bottoms out right down there in that bearing. It's hard to see, but that's where it goes. So I'm going to take my caliper. I'm going to measure that. If I measure the depth to the bottom of that, if I look at the old one, because remember this is my new 32 spline shaft, 32 spline input, that is quite a bit deeper. So it's about a 1/4 inch difference. So this little plug that sits down in there is not pressed in far enough. It's up way too high and the shaft bottoms out on it. So the shaft doesn't even ride on this thrust surface here. It's sitting a 1/4 inch above it because that stupid cap wasn't driven in far enough. So I'm gonna have to tap that down deeper like this one. And I think that's gonna solve all my problems. Well, same problem. Look how far up that oil pump thing sits. That's supposed to be touching the surface. Well, I took the brand new 32 spline input shaft out and I put the old one back in, the 27 spline, and look at that. It's another damn parts issue. Something's wrong with this 32 spline. So what it looks like to me now is the old one, you can see that bearing is recessed a little bit. I measured it, it's 140 thousandths, and this one's flush. So at least I know that this surface is at the same height on both of these things. So I'm going to try and pound that bearing down, put it back together, and see if it fits then. Yep, that was it. That damn bearing was not pressed in far enough on the 32 spline hub. Man. Now I gotta read directions on all these stinking things. Try to figure out which one of these I should use. I'm leaning towards this one. It's the one I've been using a lot lately for everything. It's more expensive than the rest of them, so it must be better, right? The flat razor blade to get all the old gasket material off of these surfaces. And I used carb cleaner to clean it, and now I'm just using a scuff pad to kind of finish the cleaning process and also give it something for this new sealer to bite to a little bit. I did use the Right Stuff sealer, this one, because it says it's for high torque surfaces. I would say a transfer case has a lot of torque going through it, twisting and torque. And I looked on some of the 4x4 forums and they recommended it too, so. All right, this thing is a wrap. It's all back together. Case halves are all sealed together. I torqued them down to about 30 foot-pounds. Same with the tail shaft. Just a little bit sealant coming out of there. This didn't really turn out the way I had hoped. I wanted this to be kind of a step-by-step video on how to rebuild one of these, but it turned into more of a troubleshooting session on how to fix a faulty part that I got. But hopefully this helped somebody out there. If they're converting one of these to a 32 spline, they'll probably run into the same issues I ran into. So hopefully all my suffering helps somebody. All right, thanks for watching.